that survived long enough to actually send back pictures showed rocks with very sharp edges. Now, if you imagine a rock at 900 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't melt into liquid, but it does sag and get soft over time. So Venus, if it's billions of years old, should have evidence of this billions of years on its surface. It doesn't. Another big problem that shocked people back in the 60s when it was first discovered is that Venus rotates backwards. In other words, here is how the planet rotates today. If you were on the surface of Venus and could actually see through that cloud cover, which you couldn't, but assuming you could, the sun would rise in the west and set in the east. Venus rotates this way, whereas it's supposed to rotate that way according to evolutionary theories of how all these things got there. So how does evolution accommodate this? Well, you see, Venus did form according to evolution, but then a long time ago, things happened. The original explanation was that there was gravitational braking on a tidal bulge. In other words, there was a bulge on the surface of Venus that gravity from other things grabbed a hold of and slowed it down and spun it around the other way. But then we found out Venus doesn't actually have a tidal bulge. It's almost perfectly round. So today's explanation is that Venus did form as predicted by evolution, but then an asteroid hit it and spun it around the wrong way. So here again we see the solution. So what is the evidence for the supposed collision? Well, Venus's axial tilt, in other words, its tilt relative to the ecliptic plane, is only 2 degrees from being perfectly perpendicular. If something had smashed into Venus, you would think it would knock it over a little bit. I mean, if something hit it hard enough to spin it all the way around the opposite way. Also, its orbit is the most circular in the solar system. It's circular up to 2 decimal places. No evidence for any collision whatsoever. Oh, but there is the fact that otherwise Venus would contradict evolutionary theory, so we know it's true. So, here's what you aren't being told about Venus. Evolution says it should be similar to Earth, but it has no magnetic field, and its crustal structure is very different. Its surface is obviously young, and it inconveniently rotates the wrong way. Now we'll go on to the planet which is near and dear to all our hearts, it being home and everything, Earth. Earth is uniquely designed for life. There are conditions here that we've not found anywhere else in the universe. First of all, our rotation period, in other words, how fast we spin on our axis, which determines how long our day is. Currently it's 24 hours, but there's no reason it has to be 24 hours, right? Times in the solar system go from 10 hours out to, I forget the number off the top of my head, but it's, I believe, 200 some odd days. So, and I hope we can edit the tape if that's wrong. But anyway, there's no reason our day has to be 24 hours long. However, if our day was too slow, that would mean extreme temperature changes because one part of the planet would be facing the sun for a lot longer than the other side. So it would be really hot on one side and really cold on the other side. On the other hand, if we rotated too fast, we'd have violent winds on this planet, which would make life here impossible. Our axial tilt is moderate, which gives us moderate seasons. Again, there's no real reason for that. Axial tilts vary dramatically all over the solar system, as we will see, but the one we have been blessed with gives us very moderate seasons. We also have a nice circular orbit, which gives us stability in our climate as we change from seasons to seasons. And none of this should really surprise us because Isaiah 45 says that the Lord himself has formed the earth and made it. He has established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. So God made it for us to live here. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's perfectly suitable for us to do that. We also have a nice atmosphere surrounding our planet. It nurtures us, protects us from deadly radiation on the one hand, gives us air to breathe on the other. And this, again, can be a widely varying characteristic across the solar system, but ours is just right. If we had a thicker atmosphere or one that had different gases in it, we would have a runaway greenhouse effect just like Venus does. On the other hand, if we went too far in the opposite direction, we could have runaway glaciation and be living on a big ball of ice. So our atmosphere is just right. We also have been blessed with a tremendous amount of water. About 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. Water is, of course, necessary for life. It's also unusual, at least from an evolutionary perspective, because none of it should be there. Remember we talked about that swirling cloudy gas and dust, how certain things can have condensed close to the sun. Well, we're too close to the sun to have all this water. So where did it come from? Well, we didn't used to have it, but after everything was formed, comets and other materials that had water came in and hit us. Now, time for a question. I don't know how much the various speakers this weekend will be getting into Noah's flood. There are certainly enough materials out in the book tables out there if you're unfamiliar with all the evidence for a global flood. But the Earth has more than enough water to flood its entire surface. This isn't really a main point of my talk, but I wanted to mention it while we're talking about water. There's lots of evidence a global flood has occurred. And again, if you're unfamiliar with that idea, I'd recommend some of the materials on the book tables to you. However, such a flood is considered unscientific because it is a non-repeatable catastrophe, and there's no experiment you can do in the laboratory to prove that an event in history has happened. Well, it's true that you can't perform experiments, but there is a lot of evidence for it, and we will see in just a few minutes how consistent the evolutionists are when they criticize us for this part of our model. Quick question, though. How much water is there really on the surface of the Earth? I mean, people, you tell them you believe in the flood of Noah, and they say, well, where'd all the water go? Obviously, there's not enough water to flood the Earth because we live on dry land. Well, if you were to squish down all the mountains on the Earth and you were to push up all the ocean floors so that the Earth's surface was perfectly smooth, obviously the water would cover the Earth, right? Because there's water. If everything was smooth, there'd be nowhere for it to drain into. It would just distribute itself across the whole globe. How deep would that water be? And the answer is over 1.5 miles. So we have more than enough water to have flooded this entire place. The only thing that is different now than it was then is that we have deeper ocean floors and slightly higher mountains. Probably before Noah's flood, the Earth was a lot different. Since all the mountain ranges have fossils on their very tips, all the mountains used to be underwater. That's not to say that the water used to be the depth of Mount Himalaya, but it is to say that the mountains used to be a lot lower, and the ocean floors probably were a lot higher. Psalm 104, incidentally, talks about the waters draining down off the land into the place where God assigned for them. I personally believe that Scripture is talking about the flood. Anyway, wanted to mention it here while we're talking about water. We also have a very protective magnetic field. Now, I've mentioned magnetic fields a couple times already. This helps us in living here. Not only does it allow us to use compasses and so on, but a lot of wildlife uses our magnetic field also. Birds and butterflies and all those things that migrate thousands of miles, they're apparently able to sense the magnetic field somehow and navigate by that. The problem from an evolutionary perspective, I've already told you that Mercury shouldn't have a magnetic field but does. Venus should have one but doesn't. Well, they can't explain why we have one either. I told you about the whole dynamo theory. I didn't give you any details. That's because the details are actually kind of lacking. What causes our field? Supposedly, like I said, fluid motions inside the core here are swirling around and causing a magnetic field. The problem is this theory doesn't work, and not only does it not work for the other planets, it doesn't work for this one, and this one is the one that the theory was invented to explain. Here's a quote from evolutionists. The mechanism for generating the geomagnetic field remains one of the central unsolved problems in geoscience. So when the evolutionist tells you he has it all figured out, pull a compass out of your pocket and say, well, how come this thing turns when I do this? Seems pretty simple, right? I mean, pretty basic thing to be able to explain if you say you have it all figured out. In fact, it gets worse for the evolutionists because since we first measured our magnetic field in 1829, its total energy has fallen by 14%. It apparently loses half its energy every 700 years or so. This has been confirmed by archaeomagnetic and paleomagnetic measurements, which, to explain the jibber-jabber there, archaeomagnetism is when you take human artifacts from a long time ago and measure imprints on like rust particles and stuff baked into clay pots or whatever. When you bake a clay pot, it turns out, and you heat things up to a certain point, the magnetic field that object is in will actually be imprinted on metal particles in the clay. So, by taking old clay pots, we can measure magnetism in those little particles and figure out what the Earth's magnetic field looked like however many hundreds of years ago we're talking about. Paleomagnetism is doing the same thing, but with things that aren't human artifacts, like a lava deposit or something. So, point is, we can measure older magnetic field imprints, and these not only show that total energy is falling, but they show wild fluctuations of polarity in the past. Our field has been swinging in polarity, in other words, north and south reversing directions, violently sometimes. It turns out, because of all this, our field can only be tens of thousands of years old, not billions. And dynamo theories can't explain any of this, incidentally.